say I have to thank Bishop Michael for his beautiful homily. What we're going to do this year was to take the relics to each churches and cathedral that we have here. But we were also, one of the aims of it was to promote Matt Talbot, or Venerable Matt Talbot, as a saint for our times. As we see of Venerable Matt Talbot is of the elderly gentleman kneeling, saying his prayers out of the chair. That's the image most people have of Venerable Matt Talbot. And that image came from, it was an artist's impression of given by all his workmates, especially his friend Paddy Laird, who worked with him in TNC markets. And I think what gets lost in the whole thing is that Matt Talbot was 28 years of age when he turned away from alcohol. He was a young man, like our young people today. He was lost and he wanted to do something different. Yes, he was a confirmed alcoholic at 16 years of age. And when we think back at that time, the drug of choice at the time was alcohol. Today, addictions are so complex and different that we have pornography, we have different drugs, we have psychedelic drugs, we have people who's addicted to work, we have people whose addictions come in many shapes and forms today. But there's one thing in common with the whole thing is that the person who falls into it was lost. And Matt Talbot was no different when we think of him back at that time. And Bishop said in his homily about when he was 28 years of age, he walked over to Newcomen Bridge and he looked in at the canal there. And that's when he got his first experience of being touched by Jesus, being touched by God. That's when he went off and he made his first pledge for 3 months. That was the first time he done it, and as Bishop said, he went on then to 6 months. So it was a bit, his journey through his recovery was very slow at the beginning. When we read the testimonies of Matt Talbot, we look at, he really wasn't much heard of him in the first 3 or 4 years. But the one thing we do know about him is that he was a daily communicant from the first day he stopped. He went to communion on that very first morning after he stopped drinking. And he did that for the next 3 months until one time he got up to go to communion after 3 months and he couldn't take himself to the altar because that inner voice was telling him he was no good. He'll never stay off the drink. So he left the church that morning. It was in Cardinal Street, and he went to a different church, and the same thing happened there. And then he ended up on the steps of the Cathedral, where he knelt down, and he outstretched his arms and he said, "Jesus, mercy, Jesus, help. Jesus, mercy, Jesus, help." And he put his trust in Jesus, and he was able to go on and receive. When I took up this work at the beginning, one of the things I was always interested in was Matt's faith journey. So I was privileged, along with my wife, with the late Archbishop Dermot Martin, let us into the archives in Clonmel. And people didn't realise that Matt Talbot had 9 Bibles, he had 350 different booklets and prayer brochures. And you could work out what he was doing at any different time in his recovery, or any different time in his life. But it was slow at the start, he eventually grew in it. And another thing that wasn't really known about him was he wasn't a great reader at the time. He was a very slow reader. And a lot of the stuff that he would be reading from scriptures, he wouldn't fully understand. So he used to write it down, and he used to bring it to Gardner Street, and he'd give it to Father Hickey. Father Hickey became Matt Talbot's spiritual director. That's what we would call him today. And he would slip it in the confectionery, and Father Hickey would read it, and he would explain it to him. So Matt was constantly learning all the time about his own faith. So his journey was slow at the beginning. progressed then into what we hear about today. So where is he relevant today? As I said, a young man, 28 years of age. And what we have to think about is, he died on 7th of June 1925, 25 years before AA or the 12 steps were even founded. And when you look at Mark Talbot's life, he was living the 12 steps long before they were even invented. He was putting us, that step 2 came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. He knew by turning to God that he would be helped. In another life, I was an addiction counsellor also, and I worked with a nun in Navan and Table House. And part of the stuff we used to look at, ask the guys to come in and look at, was the spiritual side of the problem. And we used to use Matt Talbot as an example. Because what we've realised that we know that what is any chasing? Peace of mind. They're always chasing peace of mind. That's not any of us are chasing at the end of the day, it's peace of mind. And we can't find peace of mind in a substance or in an activity or in anything like that. The only place we find is here in the tabernacle. And that's where we find it. This evening I've brought 3 relics with me. They're over here on the left hand side. And I'll just explain a little piece to you. One on the left hand side is Matt's personal rosary. That's his rosary bead. But there's an unusual thing about his rosary beads. If you look at the crucifix in it, it might be hard to see it from down there. There's a little screw in the bottom of the crucifix, and when you open that screw and open it up, there's a little piece of olive wood in it. When you think back in the time of the 1900s, the only place olive wood could have came from was from the Holy Land. So whoever who Matt knew, whoever who he came in touch with, gave him them as a present, gave him them. They seen something in that time. The middle one is the first class relic. And people often ask me, how can you have a first class relic of somebody who's undefendable? You can only have first class relics of people who's a saint. Back in 2012, when the Eucharistic Congress was on, Archbishop Dermot Martin allowed us to have a first class relic for the Eucharistic Congress, and that's how that came about. And the one on the right is one of the 3 chains that he wore. Matt wore 3 chains. He wore one around his knee, one around his waist, and one around his wrist. Now, people who look at the life of Matt Talbot, there's lots of myths about, he was into mortification, he was into the changes to be digging into. Nothing could be further from the truth. Matt Talbot didn't wear chains until the last 10 years of his life. And the only reason he ever wore a chain was given a book by his good friend, Ralph O'Callaghan, the wine merchant in Dublin, who Matt befriended. And if you look in the archives, all Matt's clothing, his old coat, the suit he wore, the hat he wore, Ralph O'Callaghan's little tag was on the inside. So he wore second-hand clothes that was handed down to him by Ralph O'Callaghan. But Ralph O'Callaghan gave him a book in 1911, True Devotion to Our Lady by St. Louis de Montfort. And any of you who've done that 23-day consecration, or who have read that book, one of the 9 external practices is the wearing of a little chain, becoming a slave to Mary, to Jesus through Mary. There's a testimony in one of the books when Matt was made venerable in 1975. There's a testimony by his friend John Hunning was his name. And John Hunning can remember making the 33-day consecration with him. And he can remember the consecration day in Galway Street in Francis Xavier, and he talks about wearing clock chains, little clock chains that you used to wear in a clock. And that's what they wore. When Bishop said about Matt died on June the 7th, collapsing in Rugby Lane, 2 years previous to that, in 1923, Matt was admitted to the matter for a heart condition and a kidney complaint. And there was no recollection in any of those medical reports about marks from chains or his body was in any way. There was nothing like that. But the one testimony from his consultant was Mr. Burke. And he spoke about having a conversation with Matt Talbot about his fasting. About fasting to extreme, in a sense where he needed, because now he had this complaint, that he needed to take on a bit more food. He wasn't asking to stop fasting, but what he was saying to him was, you probably have to eat a bit more, Mr. Talbot. And anyone who understands addicts or alcoholism, sometimes they can go to the extreme with things. So Matt wasn't going to be outdone. If he had to give up the fasting, he was going to increase the chain size from the flat chain to a chain this size. But it's also noted in those testimonies that Matt only ever wore a chain or did a 9-day novena leading up to a holy day. And we think of June 7th being Trinity Sunday. That's when he dropped dead. He was wearing the chains on the feast day. If he'd died a day later, nobody would have known anything about Matt Talbot, that he was a holy man, because the chains wouldn't be on him. It was only the sister, when his body was brought to Jerry Street, that knew there was something holy about this man because of the chains that was on him. We live in a day now where we can Google anything, and I remember looking at an old image, a black and white image of St. Therese, the little flower, and you can do this yourselves. And there's a picture of her when she joined the sisters first, black and white photograph, and round her wrist is a chain just like this one. So it was a common practice back that time to wear a chain in that sort of way. And you would do that sort of way, the novena. So Matt was a man who put his trust in God and really handed his life over to God. And we speak about that first 7 years, or 3 to 7 years where he was like missing. He knew where he was safe. When he would get up in the morning, he would go to Galway Street Church, then he'd go off over to Downing Street, then he would go to Cathedral Road. He went to John Lattimore in Salmon Road, and then he would go pro Cathedral. He knew he was safe in church. He knew he wouldn't meet his mates coming home from work. He didn't have to mix with people. But we often speak about where he used to sit at the back of the church in the early days. He never sat at the front of the church. But I suppose what he didn't realise at that time was that God's grace was touching him all the time. There's a wonderful testimony from Sean T. O'Kelly. Sean T. O'Kelly was the first president of Ireland, but he was also an altar boy at St. Joseph's in Berkeley Road. And he speaks about meeting Mr. Talbot, who would be waiting for the church to open. He sometimes would be kneeling on the steps outside, and he would open the church and let him in. And he used to always go to the right hand side and sit at the front. So there was loads of where he gave his life over to God. So what we're trying to do this year is promote the young man Talbot, the young man that was lost, that our young people are lost today. People often ask me, why are you promoting man Talbot? for alcoholism. And when I went in there, I was married, still married, thank God. My wife gave me 2 books going in there. One was a football book, was The Autobiography of Kenny Dalglish. But the other book was a hard copy of The Divine Mercy by St. Faustina. Now, I often say that wouldn't have been on my reading list at that time. So Michael wasn't going to be reading that one first, so we read the Kenny Dalglish one. But I went into treatment for all the wrong reasons. I went into treatment, I think, just to save my marriage, to save my job, to save all that sort of stuff, and get the thing back on track. So on the 3rd week I was leaving, I was having no more of it. And I was upstairs one day, packing my bag. I swung my bag around and hit the Divine Mercy book clean off the bottom. But out of the Divine Mercy book fell a prayer card to Venerable Matt Talbot. And the prayer card fell to the ground. I picked the prayer card up and I looked at the prayer card. And what seemed like a half an hour, 20 minutes to a half an hour, was really only, I'd say, about a minute and a half. But that 39-year-old man was transported in his head back to a 12-year-old boy. I was raised in a little village called Leighton on the East Coast. And I can remember being in 6th class and a father, Talbot, coming into the class and speaking about the importance of taking the pledge. And he spoke about Matt Talbot's life and how he done it for 3 months, how he done it for 6 months, how he turned his life over to God. But that 39-year-old man, that room in the Rutland in Dublin, was back as that 12-year-old boy, and I could play every sentence that Father O'Connor said. And I remember looking at the prayer card and saying to Venerable Matt Talbot, if you're as good as you're supposed to be, you'd make sure that I don't leave here tomorrow. And I didn't leave. And then I gave thanks at night. Not in the way I would give it today, but in the way then I didn't know how to pray then. I didn't know anything about prayer really. I just said thanks. So each day, for the next 3 weeks after that, I would ask Matt for a bit of help and give me the thanks at night. I'm 20 years sober next year. And my prayer life is slow, but I learned what, through the Venerable Matt Talbot, how to trust in God, how to just ask for that little bit of help in the morning, how to give a bit of thanks at night. Matt Talbot is an shining example for us today. And when we take his life apart, was he any different than when I was in church? No. Yes, the circumstances were different, as Bishop said. Times were different. The drug of choice was alcohol. Today it's a lot different. But he still felt the same. Sometimes we can make things sound nice, in a sense where Matt stood at the bridge in Newcombe Avenue and he got this spiritual awakening. But what was his thoughts? What was his thoughts that day when he was looking into the canal? When he faced all that rejection from his friends? Did he contemplate suicide? Or did he contemplate? We'll never know that. I know I contemplated suicide myself because I thought there was no way out of it. And his feelings were really no different. They're no different than the young person today. Young men and young ladies today, we're all the same down through the years. So Matt Talbot is a shining example for our young people today. We have to make him relevant to our young people. We have to speak about his young life. Not the finished article of the man who was constantly in prayer, but the man who put his trust in God in the early days of the struggle of recovery. I can remember, I don't know what he's in recovery here, but most guys that go to AA meetings usually have an anchor meeting, they call it. And I remember going, my anchor meeting was in a place called Cullen, with the monks in Cullen, the Benedictine monks. I used to go to one another night. And there used to be about 25 people go there. And I used to look at them, and there was people who was there for just being there. Then there was people who weren't drinking or drugging, but weren't happy. But then there was this small group of men and women who would be laughing over a cup of tea, would be just generally happy. And I was always interested in what made them happy. And when you spoke to them on a one-to-one basis, they had God in their life. They were able to hand their day over and give a bit of thanks and praise. We have all the different things today, different meetings we can go to. Matt was a very clever man in a way when we look back at his life. He had his different personalities. He went to Galway Street to his personality. He joined the Tour Order of Franciscans. He gave himself outlets where his prayer was going to be. And all we should do is try and follow that example of his prayer life. Because the circumstances were really no different. Any of us that's in was in addiction. We'll all run up to stealing, we'll all run up to being. You just get up to everything because when you wake up in the morning, the number one thing in your mind is drink, or drugs, or whatever what it is. And Matt Talbot was no different. So it's wonderful for us to bring the relics here and for us to see them. And it's wonderful to be able to go out to various churches and that. But the message we're trying to get across to our young people and is that Matt's famous was if he said, if I can do it, so do with the grace of God. And that's all we have to do. So I thank you for listening to me for the short while. And I will be here if anyone wants to ask me. So I hope you have a blessed rest of the evening. So thank you.